The radio signal lasted 11 seconds before it died. 11 seconds, enough time for Commander Briggs to hear 3 words that shouldn't have been possible. They're still alive. No call sign, no unit designation, no name on any manifest, any roster, any classified database the agency maintained. 12 Navy SEALs had been missing inside the Blackstone Highlands for 10 days, surrounded by a private military force that hadn't lost a target yet. And someone invisible had been keeping them breathing. Someone the United States government had no record of. If you've never seen a ghost protect people who don't know they're being protected, stay with me. Subscribe. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The last checkpoint before the Blackstone Highlands was a fuel depot, so remote it didn't appear on civilian mapping software. 2 pump stations, a corrugated steel shed that leaked heat from every seam, and a single road that wound up into the kind of elevation where the air thinned enough to make new arrivals stupid for the first 48 hours. The woman who stepped out of the cargo truck at EO 340 didn't look like someone who belonged in a place like this. She was average height, average build under the layers. Her gear was packed tight and low, nothing hanging, nothing rattling. She moved across the frozen gravel like she was reading the ground before she committed weight to each step, and the 2 depot workers who glanced up from their card game barely registered her before she'd already rounded the side of the shed and disappeared. She didn't check in, she didn't ask for directions, she already knew exactly where she was going. Her name was Raven Cole, though that designation hadn't appeared in any active personnel file for 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She'd counted. Habit. The kind that settled into the bones of people who spent too long operating in the space between sanctioned and erased. She pulled her balaclava up and moved into the dark. The Blackstone Highlands in February were not a place that tolerated mistakes. The range stretched across 400 square kilometers of granite ridgeline and compressed snowfield, elevation ranging from 8,000 to just under 14,000 feet. Wind came off the northern face in sustained gusts that could strip exposed skin in under 2 minutes. The tree line dropped out around 10,000, leaving nothing above it but rock, ice, and the kind of silence that made people talk just to confirm they were still alive. Raven didn't talk. She had a fixed objective: locate the SEAL element designated Warhorse, confirm survivors, and establish an unseen perimeter that would keep them alive until extraction became viable. The mission briefing had been informal, which meant it didn't officially exist. A man she'd worked with before, she knew him only as Garrett, and she was reasonably certain that wasn't his name, had met her in a parking structure in Spokane and handed her a laminated map with 12 grid coordinates marked in red. 12 men, he'd said, missing 10 days. The asset they were extracting has already been recovered by another route. These guys are still in there, and the contractors hunting them are not operating under capture guidelines. She'd looked at the map. Who authorized this? Garrett had almost smiled. Nobody. That's why it's you. She'd taken the map. That was the entire negotiation. It took her 31 hours to reach the first position she'd identified from topography study alone. A narrow rock shelf at 9,200 feet, angled southwest, with clean sightlines into 3 of the 4 approaches that any group moving through the Central Valley would logically use. She got there and found evidence of a camp immediately. Not the SEALs, the people hunting them. 4 positions, roughly triangulated. She counted boot impressions in the older snow, identified 2 different tread patterns, estimated group composition at 6 to 8 operators per position. They weren't local militia. The spacing was too disciplined, the positions too intelligently selected. Whoever was running this operation knew how to move in mountains. Raven crouched behind a rock formation and did not move for 22 minutes while she watched a 2-man patrol complete a sweep of the valley below. They were good. She was better. Not because she was faster or stronger, or because she'd been through some program that made her genetically superior to everyone around her. She was better because of something her first mentor, a man named Vasquez who'd died in a country she still couldn't name publicly, had drilled into her over 18 months of instruction. The most dangerous operator on any battlefield is the one the enemy isn't looking for. She ate half a protein bar, drank 4 ounces of water, and started moving again. She found the SEALs on the 3rd day. They were dug into a natural depression on the northern slope of what the topo map labeled Ridge 7, Though the ridge didn't have an official name because this entire section of the Highlands wasn't supposed to have anyone in it. The depression gave them overhead cover from aerial observation and concealment on 3 sides. But it also meant they had one exit route, and that route ran directly toward the heaviest concentration of contractor presence she'd identified. 12 men, all alive, which was itself remarkable. 2 were injured. She could tell from the way the group moved during position rotations, the careful manner in which certain tasks were redistributed without discussion. Professionals managing casualties without advertising the weakness. Their commander was easy to identify. Not because he was loudest or most aggressive, he wasn't either. He was the one who moved last when the group shifted, who checked every position before settling into his own, who oriented towards sound before anyone else reacted. Sergeant Logan Pierce. She'd been given a photograph. Brown beard now, heavier than the file image, eyes that tracked everything with a particular quality she recognized. The look of someone who had stopped trusting that the situation would resolve itself. He was holding it together. Barely. She watched them for 6 hours before she understood their supply situation. MRE count was critically low. Water was being sourced from snowmelt, which was adequate but slow. Radio batteries were failing. She'd seen 2 failed transmission attempts. The operator shaking the handset with the specific frustration of someone watching their only connection to the outside world degrade in real time. They needed extraction. They needed it days ago. What they were going to get, instead, was a ghost on their perimeter. The contractor operation was called, according to intercept fragments she'd caught on a shared frequency during her approach, something internal that translated loosely as the clearing. Clean, corporate, the kind of euphemism that companies used when they wanted plausible distance from the specifics of what they were actually paying for. The man running it was named Adrian Crow. She'd heard the name before. Garrett had mentioned it in Spokane with the particular flatness people used for individuals they genuinely respected and genuinely feared simultaneously. He's former British SAS, spent 6 years in private sector running hostage recovery, real recovery, not the clean kind. He's been operating the clearing for 2 years. Whatever you do in there, assume he's building a model of your behavior from the moment you make your first decision. She'd filed that away. Now, moving through the dark at 0200 on her 4th night in the Highlands, she was thinking about it again. Because Adrian Crow had just shifted his perimeter. The repositioning was subtle. 2 positions moved slightly north, 1 element pulled back from the eastern ridge and redistributed somewhere she hadn't been able to confirm yet. On its own, the movement was unremarkable. Routine patrol adjustment, maybe? Responding to temperature changes affecting visibility windows. Except the repositioning had happened 4 hours after she'd used a gap in their eastern coverage to cross a monitored saddle. He'd felt something. He didn't know what yet, but he'd felt it. He's building a model, Garrett had said. She needed to give him the wrong data. The first intervention happened on day 5. She'd identified an 8-man contractor element setting up a blocking position 3 kilometers north of the SEAL location. The position was good, elevated, covered, oriented to funnel anyone moving toward the extraction corridor into a compressed kill zone. If Logan's team tried to move in the next 24 hours, they would walk directly into it. Raven studied the position for 3 hours. She didn't engage. Instead, she waited until 0330, when the 2-man watch rotation produced a predictable 20-second gap in optical coverage of the southern approach to their camp. She moved through that gap, located their primary communications equipment, a ruggedized SATCOM unit secured to a pack frame leaned against a boulder, and spent 45 seconds doing something that looked, if you weren't paying close attention, like nothing at all. She was gone before the watch rotation completed. 12 hours later, when the blocking position attempted to coordinate their move, their SATCOM produced nothing but static. The backup radio had inexplicably lost battery charge. The element spent most of the day trying to troubleshoot their communications failure, never establishing contact, never executing the blocking maneuver. Logan's team didn't move that day anyway, but the window stayed open. "Something's wrong with Henley's comms again," said the man. Logan's team called Reyes Petty Officer 2nd Class Marco Reyes, 29, from El Paso, who had a habit of narrating problems like a sportscaster because he'd found it kept the team loose when everything was going sideways. Logan looked up from the map he'd been studying for the 4th consecutive hour. "Wrong how?" "Wrong like there's no signal wrong. Same as Cutter's unit day before yesterday. Same as the antenna situation before that. Environmental. Reyes pulled a face. Sir, I've been working comms for 8 years. Coal degrades batteries, sure. Coal doesn't make 3 independent systems fail in different ways in 72 hours. Logan set the map down. He looked at Petty Officer First Class Donovan Webb, his most experienced operator, who was leaning against the far wall of the depression with his eyes half closed in the way that meant he was listening to everything. Webb. I heard him, Webb said, without opening his eyes fully. Thoughts? Webb was quiet for a moment. Henley's unit failed at the antenna connector. Cutter's lost battery charge. The SATCOM last night lost its encryption module sync. A pause. Those aren't the same failure mode. So not environmental. Not the same environmental cause, anyway. Webb finally opened his eyes all the way. Could be equipment age, could be the cold hitting different components differently. But, Logan said, but if someone wanted to create communication problems without leaving evidence, they'd hit different components, make it look random. The depression went quiet. Outside, wind moved through the rocks with a sound like distant breathing. Who would do that? Reyes said. To us or to them? Nobody answered, because the honest answer was that they didn't know, and the honest answer was also the most unsettling thing any of them had thought in days. She watched them through the scope. She was 400 meters out, prone on a rock shelf that had been absorbing the thin winter sun all afternoon and was now marginally warmer than the surrounding surfaces, maybe 3 degrees, not enough to matter for comfort, enough to matter for extended observation. She'd packed insulation under her hips and chest, had pulled her breathing into the slow, regulated cycle she'd learned to sustain for hours at a time. Through the optics, she could see Logan in conference with 2 of his men. She couldn't read lips at this distance and angle, but she could read body language, and what she was reading was managed tension, the specific posture of people who had been holding themselves together long enough that the effort was becoming visible. They were good. All of them. She'd been watching long enough to develop a granular sense of the team's personality, the way each man moved and communicated and handled stress. The youngest one, she'd mentally labeled Anchor because of the tattoo visible at his wrist when he pushed up his sleeve. He was the one who kept making the others eat when no one felt like eating, who refilled water containers without being asked, who found tasks to do during the long static period so the waiting didn't become suffocating. The communications man, Reyes, talked constantly when things were stable and went completely silent when they weren't. She'd learned to use the silence as a barometer. Webb never seemed to sleep, and she'd spent 2 nights wondering if that was true or if she was simply always awake when he was. And Logan. Logan Pierce had the specific quality of someone who had learned the hard way, she suspected, based on some things she'd read in the file Garrett had provided, that leadership in a crisis wasn't about having answers. It was about making decisions with inadequate information and absorbing the weight of being wrong so that the people around you could keep functioning. She watched him fold the map. Square edges, precise. The act of someone keeping their hands busy while their mind ran calculations they couldn't share. She'd been that person. She still was. I can't get you out yet, she thought, like she could transmit it through 400 meters of frozen air. But I can keep the walls from closing. Crow's reorganization accelerated on day 6. She identified it through pattern rather than direct observation. The timing of patrol movements shifted, becoming less predictable. 2 elements that had been following consistent routes began varying their timing and spacing in ways that were specifically designed to eliminate the gaps a predictable patrol created. The blocking position that had lost communications was rebuilt with redundant systems and a dedicated security element. He was learning. Not learning that she was there, not yet, but learning that something was introducing friction into his operation. Something was making his carefully engineered net catch air instead of targets. Raven pulled back 2 kilometers and spent an entire day doing nothing except watching and thinking. The problem with operating against someone like Crow was that every action she took was data. Every intervention, however invisible she made it, had a signature. Satellite communications failed in certain ways. Batteries drained in certain ways. Ambush positions collapsed in certain ways. If he was as good as Garrett had indicated, and the way his perimeter had shifted after her first crossing suggested he would eventually derive enough signal from the noise to start building an accurate model. She needed to change her signature. She also needed to accept a harder reality. The interventions she'd been making were buying days. What Logan's team actually needed was an extraction window, and extraction windows required coordination with assets she couldn't reach without exposing communications of her own. There was one option. She didn't like it. She spent most of that day sitting with the discomfort of not liking it before she accepted it anyway. So, the supply drop she'd cached 2 kilometers from her initial insertion point contained, among other things, a short-range burst transmitter, the kind that sent compressed data packages in under a second, designed to be essentially undetectable to signals intelligence that wasn't specifically looking for that frequency. She'd been told to use it only if operational requirements created a genuine communication necessity. She hiked to the cache at night, moving slowly because the terrain between her current position and the cache location crossed 2 areas she'd flagged as possible Crow patrol routes. She gave herself 5 hours of darkness to cover 8 kilometers. She needed 4.5. The cache was intact. She retrieved the transmitter, sat with her back against a rock formation that blocked 3 compass directions, and composed a compressed message in the burst protocol Garrett had taught her. 12 survivors. Ridge 7, North Slope. Current position holding. Extraction corridor compromised via 2 contractor blocking elements, north and east. Recommend 48-hour window from my signal. Require nav support to clear eastern approach. RC. She sent it at 0412. The signal lasted less than a second. Then she waited. She was back in observation position above the SEAL camp when Reyes suddenly sat upright and grabbed his radio. "Getting something," he said. "Partial. It's fragmented, but Logan, I've got a partial on the emergency frequency." Logan crossed the depression in 4 steps. Put it on speaker. The radio produced noise, static, then something underneath the static that was almost a pattern, almost a voice, almost words. Corridor, Eastern, 48. And then nothing. "That's it," Webb said. "That's everything." Reyes turned the radio over, checked connections, looked up. Signal source was moving, not a fixed relay. Someone out there is running mobile comms. Logan stared at the radio for a long moment. "Who knows we're here?" Anchor said from the far corner quietly. Nobody answered that either. But Crow heard about the signal 12 minutes after it occurred. He was in the command post he'd established in a reclaimed shepherd shelter 4 kilometers from the SEAL position. Rough construction, barely warmer than outside, but it had walls and a door and a field table he'd had carried up in pieces. His signals intelligence operator, a Finnish contractor named Makela, who could pull frequencies out of background noise the way some people pulled threads, had been scanning continuously. "Burst transmission," Makela said, and the way he said it made Crow set down his coffee. "Under a second, compressed protocol. I caught the tail end of the carrier wave. It was already gone before I could triangulate source. Direction? Southwest. Beyond that?" Makela spread his hands. Crow sat with that for a moment. Southwest. Away from the SEAL position. Away from the contractor elements. Coming from terrain that had been screened and declared clear. "Play me the signal." Makela pulled up the capture. Less than a second of audio, heavily compressed, barely distinguishable from noise unless you knew exactly what you were listening for. Crow knew. He stood up and walked to the map on the far wall. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. "The communications failures," he said. "Sir?" "Pull the incident log. Every system failure, equipment malfunction, position breakdown in the last 6 days. Give me times and grid references." Makela pulled the log. Read out 11 entries. Crow plotted each one mentally against the map. Times and positions. 11 data points. And when he looked at the spaces between them, a shape emerged that hadn't been there when he was looking at them individually. A presence. Moving. Disciplined. Never touching the same location twice. Never establishing pattern. Almost never. He looked at entries 3 and 7. 2 interventions separated by 18 hours, both on the eastern approach to the same ridgeline. Not identical positions, but close enough that whoever was responsible had operated within a consistent geographic comfort zone. Someone who found the eastern approach tactically preferable. Someone who was very, very good. And who had, for 6 days, been invisible. Crow picked up his radio. "All elements. I want the eastern approach to Ridge 7 sealed. All observation gaps closed. We run double coverage from 2000 tonight. A pause. And someone pull me every historical file on doctrine using signature variation as primary concealment. Everything. I don't care how old. Static answered him. Then one by one, his elements confirmed. He put the radio down and looked at the map again. There you are, he thought. Not quite, but close enough to start looking. The eastern approach to Ridge 7 went quiet overnight in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Raven felt it before she confirmed it. She'd been moving back toward her primary observation shelf when the specific texture of the darkness changed. Not visually, nothing she could point to and name, but a quality in the way sound was absent that was different from natural silence. Natural silence in the Highlands had movement inside it. Wind negotiating rock formations. Small animals under snow. The distant creak of ice contracting in the cold. What she was hearing now was the silence of people holding still, and there were too many of them in too many places for it to be accidental. She went flat against a boulder and stayed there. 11 minutes. She counted her breaths to keep the number honest. 3 positions. She located them through the oldest method available, patience. A man exhaled and the vapor caught faint starlight for half a second, 20 meters to her left. Another shifted his weight, and the compression of snow made a sound no louder than a finger snap, but directionally distinct, 40 meters ahead and slightly elevated. The third she found by the absence of wind effect, a section of the approach where gusts should have moved loose surface snow but weren't because something was blocking the path. Double coverage. Overlapping fields of observation with no natural gaps. Crow had closed the eastern approach. She lay against the frozen ground and did the math on her remaining options. Northern route was monitored by the blocking element she'd disrupted, now rebuilt and hardened. Southern traverse required crossing 2 exposed saddles that were clean sightlines from 3 known contractor positions. Western approach was the longest and would put her on the wrong side of Ridge 7 relative to the SEAL camp, adding 12 hours of repositioning she couldn't afford. She was looking at a problem that had no clean solution, and she was aware that the absence of a clean solution was itself information. Crow wasn't just reacting anymore. He was shaping the space. He was using terrain to compress her options the same way she'd been using terrain to protect Logan's. He was good. She acknowledged it without letting it become anything larger than a tactical fact. Then she started moving south. The southern traverse took 4 hours and cost her more energy than she'd budgeted. The first saddle required a low crawl across 40 meters of exposed granite in a wind that averaged 23 miles per hour and gusted to something significantly worse, pressing her flat at intervals and filling every gap in her layering system with cold that had actual weight to it. She made the crossing in 3 stages, using gusts as cover for movement because the noise they generated masked her passage, and arrived at the far side with ice crystallized in her eyelashes and the first genuine finger of doubt she'd felt since entering the Highlands. She was burning reserves, food, warmth, decision-making capacity, all of them finite, all of them trending in the wrong direction. She ate the second half of a protein bar she'd been rationing for 2 days, drank deliberately, and kept moving. The second saddle was worse because it was longer, but the wind had shifted by then, and she could move faster. She was on the far side and into broken terrain before she fully registered that she'd made it. West of Ridge 7 now, wrong side. She pulled out the topo map, checked her position against terrain features she could confirm visually, and began calculating the repositioning route. 12 hours had been her original estimate. Looking at the actual ground, in actual conditions, with the energy reserve she had left, she revised that to 16. 16 hours during which anything could happen to Logan's team. She folded the map and started climbing. What happened at hour 7 of the repositioning was not something she'd planned for. She was crossing a rock field at just over 10,000 feet, moving carefully because the rocks were glazed with black ice that was invisible until weight transferred and revealed itself via the specific lurch of a boot finding no grip when she heard voices below. She went still, pressed herself into a gap between 2 boulders that wasn't quite large enough and would have to be anyway. 2 men, maybe 30 meters below, following a route along the base of the rock field. Speaking in low tones but not whispering. The casual register of people who believed they were in controlled territory. She could hear fragments. 3rd night running this route. Crow wants it doubled again starting tomorrow. For what? There's nobody out here. A pause, the sound of movement, boots on ice. Tell that to the Eastern team. They were out there 6 hours and didn't even... The wind took the rest of it. She stayed in the gap for 20 minutes after the voices faded, not moving, running cold, seeping up through the rock into her core, and fighting back with controlled breathing and the focused mental exercise Vasquez had taught her. Inventory everything around you. Name each element specifically, because a mind that's cataloging details is a mind that isn't panicking. Granite. Ice. Wind from the northwest. 2 contractor personnel heading southwest, route suggesting a patrol loop of approximately 40 minutes. Equipment visible. Suppressed carbines, plate carriers, no heavy weapons. Communications. 1 radio visible on the lead man's chest rig. When she finally moved, she was precise and efficient, and did not look at her hands to check if they were shaking, because it didn't matter whether they were. She reached the northern slope of Ridge 7 at 16:30 the following afternoon, 22 hours after she'd begun the repositioning. 6 hours over estimate. She was operating on 2 hours of cold sleep taken in a rock depression, half rations, and the specific kind of exhausted focus that felt like clarity but wasn't quite the same thing. She set up observation on the SEAL position immediately. What she saw made her recalibrate everything. Logan had moved them. Not far, perhaps 300 meters northeast from the original depression. But the new position was worse. More exposed on the western face, less overhead cover, 1 fewer covered approach for extraction. The kind of position you settled for when your first choice was compromised. She scanned the original depression through the scope, found the reason within seconds. Contractor boot prints in the snow around the perimeter, recent enough that the edges were still crisp. An element had swept the position while she was making the southern traverse. They'd come within hours of finding the SEALs. And Logan had moved the team without knowing how close the margin actually was, because he was navigating blind with failing equipment and 10 days of sustained stress and no idea that someone had been managing his perimeter. She watched him for several minutes. He was standing at the edge of the new position's best vantage point, looking east, and she recognized the posture. It was the posture of someone recalculating odds and arriving at numbers they didn't like. Inside the new position, the atmosphere had shifted in the way that enclosed spaces shift when the people in them have been carrying something too long. Reyes had stopped narrating 2 days ago. That was the barometer, and everyone felt the reading without discussing it. Webb was cleaning his rifle for the 4th time that day. Not because it needed it, but because his hands required occupation, and this was productive occupation. Anchor was rationing the last of the medical supplies with a care that suggested he'd already done the math on worse cases. Logan came back from the vantage point and sat down in the center of the position. He looked at the map he'd long since memorized, not because he expected to see something new on it, but because looking at it was a version of doing something. Options, he said. Webb didn't look up from the rifle. Same as yesterday. Walk me through them anyway. We stay. We run out of food by day 14. We move north. We hit the blocking element we tracked 2 days ago. We move east. We walk into whatever's been repositioning out there. South's a 12-hour traverse to the extraction LZ with 0 cover for the last 4 kilometers. Webb set the rifle down. That's the inventory. The signal Reyes caught, Logan said. Reyes looked up. He'd been pretending to sleep. 48 hours was what I heard. If that was a window, we're already into it. If that was anything at all, Webb said. Not dismissively. Carefully. The specific tone of someone who had decided that hope was a resource to be managed like everything else. It came from outside our net, Logan said. It used our emergency frequency. It was compressed burst protocol. That's not something random civilian equipment does. No, Webb said. It's not. Silence settled. Wind found a gap in the rock overhead and made a sound like breath. Someone's out here, Anchor said from the corner. He said it the way you say something you've been thinking for days and finally decided the benefit of saying it outweighed the cost of how it sounded. Logan looked at him. I know how that sounds, Anchor said. It sounds right, Logan said. I've thought the same thing. He looked back at the map. The ambush that didn't happen on day 3. The blocking position that couldn't communicate. The patrol that should have swept us on day 8 and came within 100 meters and turned around. He tapped the map once, not a specific location, just a gesture. Someone has been in front of us. Friendly? Reyes said. I don't know. Well, Reyes said after a pause, that's either the best thing I've heard all week or the second worst. Crow received the report from the sweep team at 1400. The depression on Ridge 7's north slope showed evidence of extended occupation. 7 to 10 days, he estimated from the debris signature. Controlled site, minimal waste, a professionally managed position that had been abandoned recently and cleanly. They moved, said the element leader, a South African named Dayan, who had the particular manner of someone who'd delivered bad news to demanding employers often enough to have developed a personal style for it. Maybe 12 hours before we arrived. Direction? Northeast. Tracking went cold in the rock field. Crow looked at the map. Northeast from the original depression put them in terrain that was marginally better for concealment, but worse for extraction angles, backed up against a cliff face that limited egress to 2 routes. They're running out of moves, Don said. Yes, Crow said, so we tighten the net. Eastern and northern approaches are already covered. We push elements into the northeast quadrant. We'll have them inside 24 hours. Crow said nothing for a moment. What? Dan said. The original position. They abandoned it how many hours before your sweep? 12. Maybe less. That sweep wasn't on the schedule Michaela broadcast yesterday. Don frowned. We changed it last night. Crow, nobody outside this operation has our schedule. I know, Crow said. He looked at the map for a long moment. 12 hours. The SEALs had moved roughly 12 hours before a sweep reached a position they'd occupied for over a week. Without an explanation, that was luck. A coincidence of timing. Crow had been doing this long enough to mistrust coincidences of timing. He thought about the 11 data points Michaela had plotted, the shape that emerged from the spaces between them. The northeast quadrant, he said finally. Push elements there, but not on a broadcast schedule. Verbal orders only from this point forward. No radio traffic regarding position assignments. Don looked at him with an expression that was almost a question. We have a third party, Crow said. It was the first time he'd said it directly, and the words had a different weight out loud than they'd had as a theory. They're not with the SEALs, they're independent, and they've been intercepting our operational communications. How long? Since the beginning, Crow turned from the map. They're very good. Better than us? The question sat in the air. Crow didn't answer it immediately, and that absence of an immediate answer was itself a kind of answer. Different, he said finally. They're using a different doctrine, one I've encountered fragments of before, but never fully. He moved to the field table and sat down. Pull everything Makala has on that burst transmission. I want to know everything we can derive about the equipment used. Makala's analysis came back 4 hours later, and it was, in its way, remarkable. The burst transmission had used a compression protocol that predated current commercial encryption standards by roughly 15 years. It wasn't outdated. It was deliberately archaic because archaic protocols were less likely to be flagged by signals intelligence systems optimized for contemporary threat signatures. Whoever had designed the transmitter had understood that the best way to hide a signal wasn't to scramble it beyond recognition, but to make it look like old noise. Where did this doctrine come from? Crow asked. Makala shrugged. Signals architecture like this, I've seen something similar once. A training document circulated in intelligence circles maybe 10 years ago. Referenced a program that was supposedly discontinued. He paused. American. Very small. Never officially acknowledged. Crow leaned back. An American covert program. Discontinued. Officially. Using doctrine so old it was invisible to modern detection. Operating independently, with no apparent coordination with the SEAL element they were protecting. He thought about the pattern of interventions. The discipline, the restraint, nothing lethal, nothing that would escalate the situation. Every action designed to preserve status quo rather than shift it. Protecting, not extracting, holding the situation stable while waiting for something. A window, an authorization, a resource that hadn't arrived yet. They're waiting, Crow said. Waiting for what? For whoever they signaled. He looked at the burst transmission data again. Which means we have a timeline, and the timeline is not in our favor. He stood up and moved to the map. The shape was clearer now, not just 11 points of data, but a coherent operational signature. A person who moved primarily at night, who operated alone, who used terrain with the specific fluency of someone who'd been trained in mountain environments, who was disciplined enough to vary pattern, but not disciplined enough to completely suppress preference for certain approach vectors. The Eastern approach kept appearing, not always, but often enough. And there was something else, something in the nature of the interventions themselves. "Pull the timeline on the SEAL casualties," Crow said. Dan looked up. "Casualties?" "We hit their position on day 2. We know 2 men were wounded. The wound indicators from the trail evidence on day 3 suggested 1 was mobile but compromised. 1 was being assisted." Crow traced a route on the map with 1 finger. By day 7, both were moving independently. No assistance indicators in the tracking. Don was quiet. "Someone provided medical support," Crow said, "from outside the SEAL element. Without making contact, there were no additional personnel signatures at any of the positions we swept." He looked at the map. "How do you treat 2 casualties from outside a position without ever entering it?" "You don't," Don said. "You do if you're very, very patient and very, very precise." Crow straightened. "And if you have a specific set of skills that almost nobody has anymore." He thought about the training document Michaela had mentioned, the program that was supposedly discontinued. He thought about what kind of person would be sent on a mission like this, alone, unsanctioned, protecting 12 people who didn't know they were being protected. The kind of patience it required, the kind of acceptance it required, a complete willingness to remain invisible even when visibility would be easier. He thought about who he would send if this were his operation. And then he thought about something Vasquez had published once, in a restricted monograph that very few people had read, something about the nature of operatives trained in what the document called non-presence doctrine, the specific psychological profile that this kind of work selected for. Vasquez. Crow pulled a name from a memory he'd filed years ago and almost never opened. A program. A lineage of training that ran through exactly 1 documented instructor before the program was buried. He went to the communications equipment and composed a query to his intelligence support team. 3 lines. The response came back in 40 minutes. He read it once, set it down, read it again. Then he looked at the map for a long time with an expression that was not quite satisfaction and not quite something else, and might have been, if he was being honest with himself, a form of respect. He knew now what he was dealing with, not a what, a who. And knowing the who told him something critically important about the how, specifically how she would respond when the situation she'd been carefully managing finally became unmanageable. When the wall she'd been holding up with invisible hands finally came down, she wouldn't retreat. She would step forward. That was the doctrine. That was the profile. That was the trap. He picked up the radio. "All elements. I'm sending new positioning orders by runner, not radio. Stand by." He looked at the map 1 final time. "We're going to let the situation deteriorate." Don stared at him. "Sir, if you want to catch something that won't come to you," Crow said, "you make the thing it's protecting need it." The deterioration Crow engineered was elegant in the way that genuinely dangerous things are elegant. Not complicated, not flashy, just precisely calibrated to produce a specific outcome. He pulled 2 contractor elements back from positions they'd held for days. On the surface, it looked like a thinning of the net, a gap opening in the northeast quadrant, right where the SEALs had relocated. Raven saw it. She spent 4 hours confirming that what she was seeing was real, because the first rule of operating against a sophisticated adversary was that you never took apparent opportunities at face value. She mapped the new positions, tracked the patrol timing, identified every observation point she could locate, and looked for the thing that didn't fit. She found 2. A position on the southern ridge that had been there for days but was now slightly repositioned in a way that gave it coverage of the gap, and a thermal signature, faint, barely distinguishable from rock bleed in the evening cooldown, but consistent with a person sitting very still, on an elevated point that had been unoccupied for the past 6 days. They weren't pulling back. They were concentrating. The gap was a door, and the door was a trap, and the trap was designed for her specifically because whoever was running this operation had figured out enough about her to know she wouldn't leave the SEALs when an opportunity appeared to open. She sat with that for a while. The temperature had dropped to somewhere below -15 with wind chill. Her water reservoir had a layer of slush at the bottom that she'd been managing by keeping the bladder close to her body, but it was losing the fight. Her food supply was down to 2 days of half rations if she was conservative, which she was being, which meant 1 day if she wasn't. She was looking at a trap set by someone who understood her well enough to predict her behavior. That was a specific kind of dangerous that went beyond tactical. It meant she'd been read, which meant she'd given something away, which meant every assumption she'd made about her own invisibility needed revision. And the SEALs were sitting in a position with two exit routes, both of which led through coverage that she now understood was deliberately arranged. The burst transmission had been 40 hours ago. The window she'd requested was 48 hours. 8 hours left, assuming anyone on the other end had received it and had assets to send. 8 hours was a long time. It was also nothing. She looked at the gap in Crow's net, the false opening, and then looked at the positions she'd identified surrounding it. Then she looked at the positions she hadn't identified yet, because Crow was good enough that there were definitely positions she hadn't identified yet. The math was not favorable. She ate a quarter protein bar, drank the last of the liquid water, and began moving northeast. Not toward the gap, around it. If she was right about how the trap was structured, there was one approach vector that Crow's repositioning had left genuinely uncovered. Not as bait, but as an actual blind spot created by the concentration of his assets toward the false opening. It was a difficult line, exposed for 200 meters across a snowfield that had no features large enough to provide real concealment. She would cross it after midnight when the temperature would drop another 8 degrees and the wind would shift north, and every contractor on that mountain would be a slightly smaller fraction of the operator they were in better conditions. So would she. That was acceptable. She just needed to be a smaller fraction than them. She found a position and waited. In the dark and the cold, with her heartbeat slow and her mind running calculations. She'd been running for 11 days, Raven Cole waited for midnight and tried not to think about the 8-hour window closing like a door. She thought about Vasquez instead, about something he'd said in the 3rd month of her training when she'd been exhausted and furious and had made a mistake that could have ended everything, and he'd sat across from her in a room with no windows and told her something she hadn't understood until years later. "The mission doesn't care how you feel about it," he'd said. "It only cares what you do next." She checked her watch. 5 hours to midnight. She settled her breathing and waited. 2 kilometers away, Adrian Crow sat in his shepherd's shelter and waited too, in the specific silence of a man who has set something in motion and is patient enough to let it run. Between them, in a cold rock depression on the northern slope of Ridge 7, Logan Pierce stared at a map he'd memorized weeks ago and felt the weight of 11 men behind him and tried to calculate what 8 hours of darkness could carry. He didn't know what was coming. None of them did. Midnight came and the temperature dropped exactly as she'd predicted, and the wind shifted north, and none of it made crossing the snowfield any easier. 200 meters of open ground with no features worth calling cover. The surface was wind-packed hard enough to support weight without sinking, which was the only good thing about it. Sinking meant sound, and sound meant everything. She'd watched the field for 90 minutes before midnight, tracking the patrol timing on the eastern side, mapping the observation angles from the elevated position she'd identified, calculating the window. 11 minutes. That was what the patrol rotation gave her, and 11 minutes across 200 meters of open snow in full kit, moving slow enough to avoid kicking up surface crystals that would catch starlight, was not comfortable math. She started at 007, prone for the first 40 meters, where the angle from the elevated position was most acute, moving in the slow, deliberate way that wasn't really movement at all from a distance. Weight transfer so gradual that the shape of her didn't change against the background, just drifted. The cold came up through her layers and pressed against the front of her body with real intention, and she focused on the breathing and the movement and the clock in her head. At 40 meters, she rose to a crouch. Faster now, still controlled, her boots finding the surface carefully because one wrong placement and the crack would carry in the cold air for 200 meters in any direction. She counted her steps unconsciously, not because counting helped, but because it was something her mind could do that didn't interfere with everything else her mind was doing. At 130 meters, she stopped. Something had changed. She couldn't name it immediately. She stayed in a crouch and let her senses run over the environment without directing them, the way Vasquez had taught her. Cast wide. Don't look for anything specific. Let the anomaly identify itself. The elevated position. The thermal signature she'd detected earlier and filed as a stationary observer. It wasn't stationary anymore. The quality of the darkness in that direction had shifted by something less than a degree, a movement so minor it registered as feeling rather than observation. They'd repositioned. Not dramatically. Maybe 20 meters, maybe less, but enough to change the coverage angle of the snowfield. She was in the new coverage window. She went flat and pressed her face into the snow and stopped breathing for 10 seconds while she processed the implications. If they'd seen her, if the repositioning was a response to spotting movement, she would know within the next 30 seconds. Light, shout, gunfire. One of the three. 30 seconds. Nothing. She let herself breathe again, slow. They hadn't seen her. The repositioning was proactive, not reactive, Crow adjusting his coverage without knowing she was already in the field. The timing was bad luck, not surveillance. Bad luck was something she could work with. She had 4 minutes left in the patrol window. The direct crossing was no longer viable. She looked left, northeast, where the snowfield ended at a broken rock margin that would give her cover but added 70 meters and a significant angle change to her route. Angle change that would take her across the repositioned observer's line of sight in a way the direct route had avoided. Right. She had the patrol approach. Wrong direction, and they'd be visible to her within 3 minutes. She looked at the ground immediately in front of her. The windpack was hardest along a slight ridge running roughly northwest to southeast. Barely perceptible as a feature, maybe 8 inches of elevation difference. Not cover, not concealment, but a shadow line when the starlight hit it at the right angle. She moved along the shadow line. Not fast. Not the way movies suggested people moved when they were desperate. No sprint, no burst of adrenaline-fueled speed. She moved the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance and letting the terrain shape her route. And 4 minutes and 20 seconds after the window should have closed, she pressed herself against the rock margin at the far edge of the snowfield and lay there for a full minute doing nothing except recovering her breathing. The patrol passed 40 meters behind her, their voices low and relaxed, people who'd seen nothing because there was nothing to see. She allowed herself 10 seconds of something that was not quite satisfaction and then started moving northeast. She reached the blind spot in Crow's net at 0140 and confirmed it was genuine within 15 minutes of patient observation. A wedge of approach terrain roughly 80 meters wide at the base, created by the concentration of assets toward the false gap that had no active coverage. It wouldn't last. He'd identify it himself eventually, or a patrol adjustment would close it inadvertently. But it existed now, and now was what she had. She moved through it in 12 minutes and established a new observation point above the SEAL position at 0222. Logan's team was still. The night rotation had 2 men awake, Webb, predictably, and a compact, quiet operator she'd mentally labeled Sergeant based on his seniority behavior. They sat at opposite ends of the position, with the alert stillness of people who were tired enough to sleep, but professional enough not to. She was settling into observation when the first thing happened. A sound from the northeast. Distant, faint, the specific flat crack of a suppressed weapon followed immediately by a second. Then a pause. Then 3 more in rapid sequence. Webb was on his feet before the third shot. The sergeant was already moving toward Logan's position. She was already scanning northeast. She found them in less than 30 seconds. A 2-man contractor element on the ridgeline 300 meters northeast, and they were not part of any positioning she'd cataloged. They'd come from the east, moving fast, and they'd engaged something on the far side of the ridge. Not the SEALs, something else. Then her scope found what they'd engaged, and her stomach did a specific thing it hadn't done in a long time. 3 figures moving down the near face of the ridgeline, moving badly. One practically carrying another, the third covering their rear. SEAL kit, SEAL movement patterns, but wrong position, wrong direction. A separate element, one she hadn't known about. The camp on Ridge 7 wasn't the only SEAL presence in the Highlands. She ran the math in the time it took the figures to cover 30 meters. 3 men, one incapacitated, moving toward Logan's position from a direction that would take them directly through 2 contractor coverage zones she'd spent days learning. The 2 contractor shooters on the ridgeline were repositioning to follow, and the sound of the engagement would reach Crow's command post within minutes, which meant every element in the net would be moving toward the contact point within 7 hours from her extraction window. Possibly nothing coming from the other end. 12 men who needed to move and couldn't. 3 more men who were already moving and about to make everything catastrophically worse. She looked at the scene through the scope and made a calculation that had nothing comfortable in it. Then she started moving. Inside the position, Logan had his team on their feet and weapons ready inside 90 seconds of the first shot. Not panicked. The specific controlled urgency of professionals whose situation had just shifted from bad to active. Northeast contact, Webb said. Suppressed fire, at least 2 shooters. Movement on the ridgeline, the sergeant, his name was Kowalski, said. 3 people, coming down fast. Our kit. Logan processed that. Our people? Moving like it. Reyes. Logan didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. Get me anything on the emergency frequency. Now. Reyes already had the radio. Static, static, static. Then a fragment, broken, barely there. Hammer element taking fire. 3 men, requesting. Hammer, Logan said. Never heard of them, Webb said. Me neither. Logan looked at the ridgeline. The 3 figures were visible now to the naked eye, moving fast, one of them clearly struggling. Doesn't matter. They're ours and they're in trouble. Logan, Webb said, with the tone that meant he was about to say something Logan didn't want to hear. I know. If we move to support, I know, Webb. We blow 11 days of holding this position. Every contractor on this mountain hears those shots. They're already moving. I know. Logan picked up his rifle. Gear up. We move to that ridgeline, cover their approach, get them in here. He looked around at 11 men who looked back at him with expressions ranging from resigned to ready, and he appreciated, in a way he couldn't articulate, that none of them argued. Double time. Anchor, your rear security, Kowalski, left flank. They moved. Raven covered 200 meters of broken terrain in the time it took Logan's element to reach the ridgeline base, and she was in position on an elevated rock shelf before the contractor pursuers completed their repositioning to follow the 3 figures down the slope. She looked through her scope at the 2 men on the ridgeline. This was the line she'd been holding for 11 days without crossing. 11 days of keeping hands off the trigger, of disabling and disrupting and manipulating without putting a round into anyone, because the moment you escalated to lethal engagement, you changed everything. The nature of the operation, the risk calculation, the rules of what could happen next. She looked at the 3 figures below. The one being carried was limp in a way that suggested something worse than a leg wound. The man carrying him was flagging, his steps shorter and shorter, his body absorbing weight. It was running out of capacity to absorb. The 3rd was covering their rear and had already fired twice more at the ridge, brave and necessary, and also a lit signal flare telling every contractor in a 2-kilometer radius exactly where they were. Logan's element was 80 meters from the ridgeline base and moving fast. The 2 contractors had clear sightlines to the 3 figures and were raising weapons. Raven put the crosshairs on the lead shooter's center mass and then moved them 4 inches left and fired. The shot hit the rock face 6 inches from the man's right shoulder. Not a miss, a message. The crack of the unsuppressed round off the rock produced a sharp spray of granite fragments, and both contractors went flat immediately. Because when an unknown shooter opens up from an unknown position with a caliber that has that kind of authority, experienced people get small. They were experienced. They got small. It bought the 3 figures 40 seconds. Raven was already repositioning. She moved 12 meters laterally, found a new support point, and watched the contractors through the scope while they tried to locate her. They were scanning the wrong elevation, looking up toward the ridgeline crest, because that was the logical position for a shooter with that angle. She was below the crest, behind a rock shelf that had been invisible in their initial scan because she'd approached it from the east and they were looking west. The 3 figures reached the ridgeline base. Logan's element reached them 30 seconds later. She heard the voices through the cold air. Not words, just tones. The rapid exchange of people who needed each other's status immediately and were getting it. Then the sounds of reorganization, equipment being redistributed, a group that had been 11, becoming 14, and absorbing the change without stopping. The 2 contractors on the ridgeline had found new cover and were communicating. She could see one of them talking into his radio with the urgency of someone who had just encountered something unexpected. Crow would have the information in minutes. 30 seconds after that, every element in the net would be redirecting. She counted assets in the valley below. 3 contractor positions she could see clearly. Two she'd identified by inference that she couldn't see but knew were there. At least two more she suspected existed but couldn't confirm. Logan's expanded element, 14 men, one of them non-ambulatory, at least two others dealing with some level of physical deficit, needed to move. The extraction window was closing, the net was tightening, and whatever she'd spent 11 days carefully preserving was now, in the space of 4 minutes, a different situation entirely. She fired again. This time at the second contractor's position, another non-lethal deflection, round into rock, designed to keep them in cover for another 60 seconds. Then she was moving again, off the shelf, dropping to a lower tier, repositioning toward a gap that would give her coverage of the valley approach while Logan's group moved. The cold hit her face as she moved, and she registered it and filed it away. Her fingers were operating on the specific automatic efficiency of extremities that knew their job and were doing it without consultation. She changed position, found a rest, scanned. Two contractor elements moving up from the valley floor, responding to the contact, converging on the ridgeline, moving fast and without particular caution because they had numbers and a fix on location and the confidence of people who believed they had the situation contained. She looked at Logan's group below. They were moving now, west along the ridgeline base, the configuration tight and controlled. Webb on the left flank, Kowalski covering rear. Logan in the center, guiding. The three hammer element survivors absorbed into the formation, moving in the right direction, moving toward the extraction corridor, moving toward 6 contractor positions between them and the LZ. Raven reset her position, brought the scope up, and started doing things she hadn't done in a long time. The next 40 minutes were the most concentrated work she'd done since she'd entered the Highlands. She couldn't stop the net. There were too many elements, and they were too dispersed, and she was one person with a finite ammunition load. What she could do was influence it, shape the timing, create hesitation in the right places at the right moments. She put a round into the rock face in front of the lead element from the valley floor, not close enough to constitute clear fire, just present enough to produce a reaction. They slowed. They spread out. They started moving with more caution than they'd been using, sweeping before advancing, which ate time. She was already repositioning. She found the second valley element 50 meters further east and repeated the process, not targeting them, just existing at an angle and elevation that made them uncertain. Uncertain people move slower. Slower movement was the resource she was manufacturing. She was burning through position and ammunition and energy, and she knew it. The cold was making the rifle heavier than it actually was. Her right eye was tearing from the wind, and the scope kept needing to be cleared. She wiped it on the back of her glove and repositioned and found a new rest and kept working. Below, Logan's group had covered 300 meters. Not enough. The extraction corridor was still 2 kilometers out, and between here and there were the 2 positions she'd never confirmed, the ones she suspected but couldn't place. She needed to find them. She pulled back from the immediate threat management and spent 90 seconds she couldn't really afford, scanning the valley floor and the approaches systematically, looking for the thing that didn't fit, the feature that was slightly wrong, the shadow that was a degree too regular, the absence of movement where movement should be. She found one. Northeast face of the valley, behind a rock formation she'd assessed as unoccupied 3 days ago. A 2-man element, stationary, oriented toward the extraction corridor. Perfect ambush position. They hadn't moved in response to the contact noise because they were disciplined enough to hold their assigned position, and that discipline had kept them invisible. They were directly in Logan's path. She looked at the range. 700 meters, cold air, wind variable, target partially obscured by the rock formation. A difficult shot under controlled conditions. In current conditions, with her current physical state, with wind she hadn't had time to fully read, she didn't have another option. She ran the wind off the snow surface pattern she could see in the valley floor. Estimated 8 to 10 miles per hour from the north-northwest, gusting irregular. Temperature and altitude adjustment. The partial concealment of the formation meant she needed a specific entry angle that put the round through a gap she could see but hadn't ranged. She settled her breathing. Her heartbeat was elevated from the repositioning, and she couldn't fully bring it down, so she found the pause between beats and worked with it. She fired. The round hit the rock face 18 inches from the gap she'd been aiming for, not through it, but close enough to the two men behind it that both of them moved, fast, breaking their discipline and their position and giving away their location completely. Not the shot she'd intended. Acceptable result. She marked the position in her memory and looked for the 14th, the last unconfirmed element. She didn't find it, because it found her. The round came from above and behind, and it didn't hit her. It hit the rock shelf she'd been using as a rest, and the fragmentation spray from the impact cut across her right cheekbone and destroyed her scope's objective lens in a single event that left her suddenly blind in the eye, pressed to the optic and bleeding from a laceration she couldn't immediately assess. She rolled left by reflex. Down off the shelf, dropping 2 meters to a lower ledge she'd identified as a secondary position but hadn't planned to use like this. Her back hit rock and she rolled again, putting the shelf above between herself and the angle the round had come from. She lay still for 3 seconds. Her right eye was working. The blood was from the cheek, not the eye. She confirmed that by the location of the sting and the fact that she could see, though everything on the right side was swimming in the specific way of a fresh laceration that hadn't decided how serious it was going to be yet. The scope was destroyed. She had iron sights on a rifle she'd been using with a scope for 11 days, in conditions she'd been managing with the magnification assistance of that scope, and somewhere above her was a shooter who had found her position and very nearly solved her. She looked at the iron sights and made the adjustment in her head and looked up at the ridgeline above her for the shooter. She found him in the way that came from 11 days of reading this specific mountain, a shape at 900 feet that was wrong, in a position that should have been empty, holding very still in the manner of someone who had fired one very good shot and was now waiting to see if it had done the job. It hadn't. She looked at him through iron sights at a range she estimated at 300 meters, in failing light, with blood running down the right side of her face, and thought about everything that had led to this moment. 11 days of invisibility, 11 days of staying out of the fight in every way that counted, of managing and adjusting and preserving the situation without becoming part of it. Below her, Logan's element had stopped. They'd heard the shot. Not her fire, the shot that had nearly ended her. They were stationary now, weapons up, scanning for contact they couldn't see. They were in the open. The ambush position she'd burned with the 700-meter shot was recovering. She could see movement behind the rock formation. The valley elements were still advancing, slower now, but still coming. And the shooter above her was shifting position, slow and professional, looking for a new angle. Everything that had been carefully managed for 11 days was unmanaging itself in real time. She put the iron sights on the shooter at 300 meters and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was very tired of being invisible. She fired. The round hit him in the right shoulder and took him off the ridgeline in a way that was conclusive. Not lethal. The angle and distance put the round where she'd aimed it, but conclusive. He was done. He wasn't coming back to this fight. She was already moving. Down from the shelf, onto the valley slope, moving toward Logan's position in a direct line that she would never have used 20 minutes ago. She covered 300 meters in less than 2 minutes, running in the specific way of someone who has moved past caring about noise discipline, because noise discipline was no longer the relevant variable. She came in from the southwest, and the first person who saw her was Anchor, the youngest, the one who'd been keeping everyone fed and watered for 11 days. And his reaction when a figure materialized out of the dark, running, bleeding from the face, with a rifle was to raise his own weapon and then lower it in the same motion, because something in the way she moved said, "Don't." "Contact," he called anyway, because protocol. She reached the formation and went to one knee, breathing, scanning the approaches behind her. 14 men around her suddenly. Weapons up, all of them, pointed at her until they weren't sure who to point at. Logan stepped forward. He looked at her. At the blood on her cheek, the destroyed scope on the rifle, the kit that said American, and the eyes that said something he didn't have a word for yet. "Who are you?" he said. She looked at him. She thought about Garrett in the parking structure in Spokane. She thought about Vasquez and the training room with no windows, and the instruction never to say more than was necessary. "Nobody," she said. "You need to move. Now." Logan held her gaze for 2 seconds. "Which direction?" She pointed southwest. Not the corridor they'd been heading for. A different line, one that bypassed the recovering ambush position and the valley elements both. "That's not the extraction corridor," Webb said from behind Logan. The extraction corridor has 6 contractors in it, she said. This one doesn't. Webb looked at Logan. Move, Logan said. They moved. She took point. That was new. 11 days of operating behind them, ahead of them, around them, without ever being among them. And now she was at the front of a 14-man element moving through a mountain she'd spent almost 2 weeks learning in a way that none of them had. And the shift in her position relative to this group felt like crossing a border she hadn't planned to cross. She didn't look back. She picked the route by feel and memory and the specific topographic intuition that came from having walked every viable approach multiple times. And she moved them through the dark with a pace that was faster than comfortable and slower than necessary, calibrated to keep the man being carried viable and the 2 walking wounded from failing. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of Crow's net reorganizing. Distant shouts, radio calls, vehicle sounds from the low valley that suggested mobile assets being repositioned. The shot she'd put into the shooter on the ridgeline had changed the calculus. Wounded personnel required attention, and the uncertainty about how many additional shooters might be operating in the area would slow any pursuit commander who was worth his salary, because a good pursuit commander didn't chase into unknown contact without understanding what he was chasing into. Crow would know immediately what it meant, that the invisible presence he'd been tracking had gone loud, that it had engaged, that the shape of the operation had fundamentally changed. She thought about what Crow would do with that information. She thought about it while she led 14 men through a mountain she was getting to know better than she'd ever intended. A quarter mile behind her, Crow stood at the edge of his shepherd's shelter and listened to the reports coming in and felt the operation shifting in his hands like something alive. He'd been right about the profile, right about the response. She hadn't retreated when the situation became critical. She'd stepped forward, exactly as the doctrine predicted. What he hadn't predicted was the accuracy at 300 meters with iron sights in those conditions. And he hadn't predicted the route she'd chosen, which was neither of the 2 options his terrain analysis had identified as viable for a group of that size and composition. He looked at the map. He looked at where she was taking them. His expression changed slightly. Not alarm. Something more precise than alarm. The route she'd chosen, the one that wasn't the extraction corridor, the one that bypassed his forward elements, would bring them out at a position on the western face of the highlands that he hadn't fully covered because the terrain made it logistically difficult, and he'd assessed it as too exposed for a group trying to avoid observation. She wasn't trying to avoid observation anymore. She was trying to reach a specific location. A location that his intelligence analysis 6 hours ago had determined was the most likely landing zone for any extraction asset that had received a burst transmission in a 48-hour window. She hadn't given up on the window. All elements, Crow said into the radio, with the specific flat calm he'd developed over years for moments that didn't allow anything else. Redirect to the western face. Grid reference follows. Maximum speed. A pause. She's going for extraction. He picked up his personal kit and started moving, because some things you didn't delegate. The non-ambulatory hammer element casualty. She still didn't know any of their names and hadn't asked, because names weren't the relevant variable, was fading. She could hear it in the breathing rhythm of the man carrying him, the adjusted cadence that came from compensating for dead weight that had been getting heavier for 3 hours. She stopped the group at a natural rock shelter and turned. 2 minutes, she said. The man carrying the casualty set him down with the relief of someone who hadn't realized how close to the limit they were until the weight was gone. Anchor was already moving, checking the casualty's status with the efficient hands of someone who'd been keeping these men alive in the specific ways that quiet people keep other people alive. She looked at Logan. "How far?" he said. 40 minutes at this pace, 20 if we push." "Can he handle 20? She looked at Anchor, who looked up and made a specific expression. Not a nod, not a shake, something in between that meant, "I don't know, and we might not have a choice." "He handles it, or he doesn't," she said. "If we take 40, Crow has elements at the LZ before us." Logan looked at the casualty, looked at his team, looked at her. "You know Crow," he said. Not a question. "I know the type. But specifically, yes." "Is he going to catch us?" She held his gaze. Behind him, 11 SEALs and 3 survivors who'd come out of a ridgeline firefight waited in the dark with the particular stillness of people who'd been waiting for a real answer to a question like this for 11 days. "Not if we move in the next 90 seconds, she said. Logan nodded once. "Push," he said over his shoulder. They pushed. She turned back to the route and set a pace that hurt and kept going. The mountains stayed dark around them, wind coming hard off the northern face now, and somewhere behind her she could feel Crow's elements moving. She couldn't hear them, not yet, but she knew they were there the way you know a thing without being able to see it, from experience and pattern and the specific feeling of being understood by someone who has studied you. The LZ was 40 minutes out. She had a destroyed scope, a bleeding cheek, 2 days of half rations behind her, and a route she'd chosen because it was the one thing Crow would be slowest to fully cover. She didn't know if the extraction asset was there. She didn't know if the window had held. She ran the math and kept moving and did not let the uncertainty become anything larger than itself, because the mission didn't care how she felt about it. It only cared what she did next. The LZ was a flat granite shelf on the western face, maybe 60 meters across, exposed on 3 sides and backed against a cliff that dropped 40 feet to a snow-filled gulch below. Not a good landing zone by any standard definition. Too small, too exposed, no go-around options if the pilot came in wrong. She'd chosen it because it was the one location in this section of the Highlands that Crow's net couldn't cover quickly from any of his known positions, and because the cliff behind it meant anyone approaching from the east had to come through a single choke point that she could watch. What she hadn't been certain about, until she heard it, was whether anything would come for them at all. The sound arrived before the visual, a low rhythmic percussion working against the wind from the southwest, the specific frequency of rotor blades that she'd been listening for without letting herself expect. She stopped the group at the rock margin above the shelf and held up a fist, and 14 men went still in the dark. "That's a bird," Reyes said, somewhere behind her, his voice doing something it hadn't done in days. "I hear it," Logan said. She was already scanning the shelf. Empty. The choke point to the east, also empty, for now. She looked southwest and found the running lights, low and fast, coming in below the ridgeline to avoid radar returns. A pavehawk. Military configuration. Moving like the pilot knew exactly where he was going and had no interest in being there longer than necessary. "Move," she said. "Get to the shelf. Keep the wounded central. When that aircraft touches down, you load from the rear, fast, and you don't wait for anything." "What about you?" Anchor said. She didn't answer him. She was already moving to the choke point. The pavehawk came in steep and fast, and landed with the controlled aggression of a crew that had been briefed on hostile LZ procedures, and was taking them seriously. The rotor wash hit the shelf like a physical thing, throwing snow crystals horizontally, and Logan's group moved into it with their heads down and their weapons up, and the practiced urgency of people who had been waiting a long time for exactly this and weren't going to waste it. Raven was 30 meters east at the choke point, watching the approach terrain. They came from the north first. 2 contractor elements, moving fast and not bothering with the caution that had slowed them earlier. Too much urgency now, the sound of the aircraft making concealment pointless. She could see them against the snow, dark shapes running hard, maybe 300 meters out. She put 2 rounds into the rock face in front of the lead element. Not at them. In front of them. The rounds cracked off granite and both elements went to cover by reflex. She had maybe 90 seconds before they assessed the threat and started maneuvering around it. She looked back at the shelf. 8 men loaded. 9. The casualty being handed up by 2 men who were barely managing the lift. 10. 11. Another element from the south. She hadn't seen them coming. They'd used the cliff edge as cover and come around it from below, which meant they'd been moving before Crow's redirect order, which meant Crow had anticipated the western face earlier than she'd thought. 4 men, 50 meters out, not slowing down. She turned fully and engaged. First round, lead man, right leg. He went down hard and the element stopped. Not from the hit, but from the sudden recalculation that always happened when a member went down and the cover threat wasn't located. She was already moving, 2 meters left, finding a new position behind a rock formation she'd noticed on the way up. Second round, their rightmost man's carbine. She hit the receiver and the weapon came apart in his hands, and he dropped the pieces and looked at them with an expression she could read even at this distance. Sometimes the shot that broke the equipment was more demoralizing than the shot that hit a person. The two remaining members of the southern element dragged their wounded man back around the cliff edge. She turned back to the shelf. 12 loaded. 13. Logan was standing at the helicopter's door, looking at her. She shook her head once, pointed at the aircraft. He didn't move. "Logan," she heard Webb say from inside the aircraft. Logan looked at her for 2 more seconds. 2 seconds was a long time. Then he stepped up and into the Pavehawk, and the aircraft was already lifting before the door was fully closed, the pilot not wasting a heartbeat, and the rotor wash redoubled across the shelf, and she pressed herself flat against the rock formation as the aircraft rose, cleared the cliff edge, dropped its nose, and was gone southwest in under 20 seconds. The sound diminished. The wind filled the space where it had been. She stayed still at the rock formation and counted. 12 seconds. The northern elements came around their cover cautiously, finding nothing at the choke point. The southern element reappeared at the cliff edge, also cautious. Neither group rushed. They'd established by now that the shooter was capable of making them regret rushing. She was already moving east along the cliff base, away from the shelf, using the cliff face as cover, not running. Moving with the deliberate care of someone who needed to not be found in the next several hours, and was making every decision in service of that goal. Behind her, the Pavehawk was already 10 kilometers southwest and accelerating. 14 people, all of them alive. She moved into the dark and felt the bleeding from her cheek had slowed and thought about the next 6 hours and what they required of her. She found a shelter positioned 2 kilometers east of the LZ at 0430, a rock overhang that wasn't quite a cave but was enough to kill the wind and bring the effective temperature up to something her body could manage. She got inside it, checked the cheek laceration by feel, and confirmed it was superficial, ate her last full ration bar, and sat in the dark for 90 minutes, not sleeping but not quite awake either, in the specific suspended state her body used to recover when sleep wasn't an option. At 0600, she retrieved her secondary cache, a smaller kit she'd positioned before entering the main operation, containing 1 day of full rations, a replacement radio unit, and a medical kit. She treated the laceration properly for the first time, which involved things that weren't comfortable and that she did without particular drama because they needed to be done. She composed a second burst transmission at 0612. Package delivered. 14. All mobile or recovering. Shooter engaged, minor wound, still operational. Extracting independently. RC she sent it. Drank half her water. Checked her ammunition. Began calculating the extraction route. Crow was still out there. His operation had failed at its primary objective. The SEALs were gone, the Hammer survivors were gone. But Crow wasn't the type to pack up cleanly. He would be running his own analysis, reconstructing the timeline, understanding exactly what had happened and why. And he knew she was still on the mountain. She thought about that while she assembled the route. She'd expected, at some level, that the extraction of Logan's group would functionally end the operation. Crow's contract was for the SEALs, and with the SEALs gone, the commercial logic of continuing was questionable. But commercial logic and personal investment weren't always the same thing. She didn't know Crow well enough to predict which would win. She started moving southeast. He found her at noon. Not physically. She was still 2 kilometers ahead of any pursuit element she'd identified, and she was reasonably confident she hadn't been directly observed since leaving the LZ area. He found her the way he'd been finding her for days, through the accumulated data of her pattern, and the specific thing that told her was when his elements stopped moving. Not retreating, not advancing, stopped, like they were waiting for her to come to them. She went still in a rock field and studied the terrain ahead. She'd been routing toward a southern descent that would bring her below the snow line and into forested terrain where extraction by vehicle became viable. The southern descent ran through a valley she'd assessed as the lowest risk route. The elements were positioned in that valley, not blocking it, flanking it. A different configuration, not a net designed to catch something moving blindly, but a corridor designed to guide something moving intelligently. There was a path through their positioning, a clear path. She looked at the clear path for a long time. Then she looked at the terrain around the clear path, the elevations, the angles, the observation positions. The clear path led to a specific location, a flat area, partially sheltered, with room for 2 people to stand and see each other clearly. She thought about that. Then she changed course and walked directly toward it. I was already there when she arrived. Adrian Crowe was standing in the center of the flat area with his rifle slung across his back. Not ready, not lowered, just slung, and his hands visible at his sides. He was shorter than she'd imagined from the operational profile, with the compact build of someone who'd spent decades carrying weight over difficult terrain, and a face that showed the specific weathering of a man who worked outside in bad conditions and hadn't particularly tried to avoid it. He watched her come down the slope without moving. She stopped 12 meters from him with her own rifle at low ready. Not aimed, but present. She was aware of his elements on the flanks, aware that she was in a position that was, technically, surrounded. And she was also aware that if he'd wanted her dead, he'd had cleaner options than this. They looked at each other for a moment. "You walk like Vasquez," he said. His accent was still primarily British, with something continental underneath it. Same weight distribution, same pattern of looking before committing to a step. "You knew him," she said. "Of him. We operated in proximity once, years ago. Different principles." He paused. He was the best I'd seen at that point. She didn't say anything. "You're better," Crowe said. It wasn't flattery. It was a field assessment, delivered the way field assessments were delivered, factually, because accuracy mattered more than comfort. "Is that why we're here?" she said. "Partly." He looked at her cheek. "That needs stitching. I'm aware." "The man who took that shot, you put him down cleanly. He'll recover." "Yes." Crowe was quiet for a moment. "So will mine. All of them." She understood what he was telling her. Every engagement she'd made over the last 12 hours, the deflection shots, the non-lethal hits, had been precise in ways that could not have been accidental, and he'd done the post-incident analysis and reached the correct conclusion. "What do you want, Crowe?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, thinking. The kind of thinking that showed on a person's face as stillness rather than movement. "I want to understand the doctrine," he said. "The complete doctrine, not the fragments that circulated. The program's closed. I know. I've read the dissolution papers, or what was made available." He looked at her. "Vasquez wrote a monograph in the last year before the program ended. It was never circulated. I've been trying to locate it for 4 years." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because what I watched you do for 11 days on this mountain is the most sophisticated individual field operation I've seen in 20 years of doing this." He didn't look away. "And because the doctrine behind it is more valuable than anything else the program produced, and if it dies with the people who carry it, that's a waste that bothers me." "It's not your doctrine to want." "No," he said. "It isn't." They stood in the mountain cold with 12 of his personnel somewhere in the rocks around them, and the wind coming off the northern face, and neither of them moved. "You engineered the deterioration," she said. "Yes." "You knew it would force me into the open." "The profile suggested it. You confirmed it." He paused. "I didn't anticipate the hammer element. That was genuinely coincidental timing." "No," she said. "You pulled back that eastern coverage deliberately. The gap I used for the snowfield crossing, you left it." He was quiet. "You wanted to see how I moved," she said. "You left the gap to collect data, not because you missed it. You don't miss things." Something shifted in his expression. Minimal, a slight adjustment around the eyes. "No," he said, "I don't." "Then you already knew roughly what you know now before you forced the engagement." "I knew the capability," he said. "I wanted to understand the person." The wind moved between them. Behind him, one of his flanking elements shifted position slightly, and she tracked it without moving her eyes from his face. "The hammer element survivor," she said. "The one we were carrying. He'll be in a surgical facility within the hour. We have assets in the area." Crowe looked at her steadily. "Whatever you think of the contract, we don't leave people to die on a mountain." She believed him. That was the uncomfortable part. "This conversation happened because you have something to say that isn't about the doctrine," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "The debrief you're about to go through, your handler, Garrett, I assume, based on the transmission protocol, he's going to file this operation in the same drawer everything gets filed in, the drawer no one opens. That's the arrangement. The arrangement wastes you. That's not your assessment to make." "No," he said, "it isn't." He reached into his jacket and produced a card. Actual paper, which felt almost anachronistic. He held it out toward her. But it's mine to offer an alternative. She didn't take it. You want to hire the person who just dismantled your operation. I want to hire the person who kept 12 men alive for 11 days without them knowing it and then got them out when the situation changed. Yes. He didn't lower the card. The clearing isn't what the contract on this operation suggests it is. We take work that doesn't fit elsewhere, work that requires a specific kind of person. I know what you take. Then you know we could use someone who operates like you do. She looked at the card, at him. No, she said. He nodded once, like she'd confirmed something rather than refused something. He put the card back in his pocket. Then walk out of here, he said. My elements will stand down. You have clear passage south. She looked at him. That's simple. You were never my target, he said. The seals were the contract. The contract is concluded. He paused. You were a complication that turned into something else. What did it turn into? He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. A reminder, he said, that there are still people doing this work the right way. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned south and started walking. She didn't look back. She didn't hear him move, which meant he was still standing there, watching her go, and she thought briefly about what it meant that the most honest conversation she'd had in years had been with a man she'd spent a week fighting from the shadows. She walked past the rock positions where his elements waited and none of them moved. The mountain let her go. The debrief happened in a conference room in a federal building in a city she was asked not to name in any documentation, which was itself a kind of naming. Garrett was there. 2 people she didn't know, one of whom had the specific posture of a person who made decisions about programs like hers and understood that posture communicated authority without requiring him to say anything. The man with posture was named Hale. He told her that at the start and nothing else about himself. Walk me through it, Garrett said, from insertion. She walked them through it. 16 days condensed into 40 minutes of factual reporting, the way it was always done. Chronological, specific, no editorializing, no emotional content. Equipment status, intervention methodology, engagement parameters, extraction sequence. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The engagements on the western face, Hale said. You used lethal force. Non-lethal engagement, she said. 1 shoulder wound, 1 weapon disabled, deflection shots throughout. The shoulder wound was non-lethal by design. The range and angle gave me the choice. I made it. Hale looked at his notes. The operational guidelines for this insertion authorize lethal force in defense of the protected element. I'm aware. You chose not to use it. I chose to use what the situation required and nothing more. Hale wrote something down. She watched his pen move without watching the words. Crow, he said. What about him? You made direct contact. Yes. Unplanned. He engineered the meeting. I walked into it with full awareness that it was engineered. And the conversation. He offered employment. I declined. Garrett was looking at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone who was performing neutrality for the benefit of a third party and finding it effortful. He mentioned the monograph, she said. Vasquez's final document. Garrett's neutrality cracked slightly. What about it? He's been trying to locate it for 4 years. That's not possible. That document was destroyed during the dissolution. She looked at him for a moment. Is it possible you believe that because someone told you it was destroyed? The room was quiet. Crow has significant intelligence resources, she continued. If he's been looking for 4 years and hasn't found it, either it's genuinely gone or someone has kept it very well. She paused. But he knew enough about the doctrine to identify me. He knew enough to build a model of my behavior that nearly caught me. He caught you, Hale said. He created conditions where I chose to become visible, she said. That's a different thing. Hale set down his pen. He looked at her with the specific attention of someone recalibrating an estimate. The SEALs after action will credit favorable terrain and exceptional leadership for their survival. That's appropriate. Your name appears nowhere in any documentation. That's the arrangement. Does that bother you? She looked at him for a moment. He'd asked it with a flatness that suggested he expected the professional answer, the one that said no and meant it. She gave him the honest one instead. Yes, she said. Some of it bothers me. Not the part about my name. She looked at the table surface. The part about Vasquez. He developed that doctrine over 30 years. It worked. It kept people alive in ways that nothing else does. And the program that carried it got dissolved because it was inconvenient, and the doctrine is going to disappear. And the 12 men who just got extracted alive don't know why they're alive, and that bothers me. She looked up. Not for me, for the methodology. Hale was quiet. What are you suggesting? Garrett said. I'm not suggesting anything. You asked if it bothered me. You're suggesting something. She looked at him. The doctrine needs to exist somewhere that isn't inside one person's working memory. It needs to be taught. Vasquez taught it to me. Someone should teach it to whoever comes next. That sounds like a pitch for program reinstatement, Hale said. That sounds like common sense. Hale looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at his hands. The kind of silence that went on long enough to stop being about the previous statement and started being about something that was already being calculated. Your physical status, Garrett said finally. The laceration. Superficial. Closed. Recovery estimate. 2 weeks for the cheek. The cold exposure needs monitoring. Otherwise, I'm operational. You're not operational, Hale said. You're on medical stand-down effective now. She looked at him. 2 weeks, he said. Then we talk. About what? He picked up his pen again. Didn't write anything. Set it down. About what happens next, he said. She was in a government-rate hotel room in the same unnamed city when Logan Pierce found her. She didn't know how he'd found her. She didn't ask. Some questions were less important than others. He knocked once, and she opened the door, and they looked at each other in the hallway light. And he looked like someone who had slept for 12 hours and was still running a deficit. And she looked like someone who had a row of butterfly closures on her cheek and a bruise across the left side of her jaw she didn't remember acquiring. Can I come in? He said. She stepped back. He came inside, and she closed the door, and he stood in the middle of the room, looking at it like he wasn't sure what he'd planned to say when he got here. Sit down, she said. You look like you need to. He sat on the edge of the bed. She took the chair across from him. Webb reconstructed the positions, he said. Every firing position from the last 3 nights. He found 31 separate locations, ranging from 400 to just under 800 meters from where we were at any given time. He looked at her. 31 positions, 12 days. She didn't say anything. He filed an informal report, Logan said. I told him not to. He did it anyway. What did it say? That someone was there, and that we survived because they chose not to be seen. He paused. He wrote it because he said if it happened to him, he'd want it documented somewhere, even somewhere no one would ever read. She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that was trying to be several things simultaneously. Gratitude, which was the one he'd planned to lead with, and something underneath it that was harder to name. Your men, she said. How are they? 1 surgery, successful. 2 wound complications being managed. Everyone else, walking, talking, annoying the medical staff. He almost smiled. Anchor wouldn't eat the hospital food, said it wasn't as good as what he'd been making in a rock hole for 10 days. He's right. MREs have more caloric density. I'll tell him you said that. He'll love it. Logan looked at his hands. The hammer element. 3 men we didn't know were in there. There were only supposed to be 12 of you, she said. Apparently not. He was quiet for a moment. The man you were carrying, he's in recovery. He's going to make it. She absorbed that, set it somewhere it could settle. You saved 15 people, Logan said. 14. The hammer element saved themselves until they couldn't. 15, he said again, with the specific firmness of someone making a point that mattered to them. She looked at him. He reached into his jacket and put something on the small table between them. A compass. Old, the kind with a brass housing that showed where and the specific places where someone had held it the same way for years. Thumb on the left edge, index finger on the top. The face was slightly yellowed, but the needle moved freely. My grandfather carried it in Korea, he said. My father carried it. It's been in 7 different countries in my own kit. He looked at it. I left it in the observation post on the last night before extraction, with a note. She looked at the compass. I know. I figured. He looked up. The note was inadequate. I knew it when I wrote it. I didn't have the right words. He paused. I still don't. She looked at the compass for a long moment. The brass housing, the worn edges where a thumb had rested for decades. Keep it, she said. It's yours. It's your family's. I want it to belong to this, he said. He wasn't looking at her now, looking at the compass, and she thought he was choosing words carefully in the way of someone who didn't speak carefully very often and was making the effort because it was owed. Whatever you do next, wherever you go, I want this thing that my family has carried through the worst moments to be part of what you carry. He looked up. Because you carried us when we couldn't carry ourselves. And that deserves something real. The room was quiet. The heater ticked. She picked up the compass. It was heavier than she'd expected. The brass had absorbed warmth from his jacket. I don't know your name, he said. I don't expect you to tell me. No. Then I just want you to know. He stopped, started again. My son is 9. He plays soccer and he's terrible at it, and he loves it anyway, and I was going to miss his entire season. He looked at the floor. I got home last night. He was asleep. I sat on the edge of his bed for an hour. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. Some things needed to exist without a response, and she sat with that and let it be what it was. After a while, Logan stood up. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Webb's report, he said. The informal one. Where does it go? Somewhere it gets filed and no one reads it, she said. Probably. But it exists. Yes. He nodded slowly. Good, he said. That's something. He opened the door and left. She sat in the chair with the compass in her hand, and the heater ticking and the weight of 16 days settling into the room around her. And she didn't feel like a ghost, and she didn't feel like a hero, and she felt, more than anything, the specific exhaustion of someone who had been holding something up for a very long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. The compass was warm in her hand. She held on to it and let the room be quiet. She stayed in the hotel room for 3 days. Not because she was ordered to, not entirely. The medical stand-down gave her cover, but the truth was simpler and less professional. She was tired in a way that sleep didn't reach, the kind of tired that accumulated across years of operating in the space between sanctioned and erased. And the room was quiet, and no one was asking anything of her, and for 3 days she allowed that to be enough. She ate real food, slept in actual intervals, sat by the window in the early mornings with the compass in her hand and watched the city do its ordinary things, traffic lights cycling, people moving between buildings with the particular purposefulness of people who had places to be and knew where those places were. She'd spent most of her adult life being purposeful in ways she couldn't explain to anyone. On the second morning, she found herself thinking about Vasquez, which wasn't unusual. She thought about him with some regularity, but thinking about him differently than she normally did. Normally, she thought about his instructions, his methodology, the specific technical architecture of the doctrine he'd spent 30 years building and 18 months transmitting to her. Now she was thinking about him as a person. The way he'd looked in the training room at year 2 when he understood she'd absorbed everything he had to give and hadn't said anything about it for 3 days, just watched her run exercises with an expression she hadn't been able to read then and could read now. Pride, she thought. The specific kind that belongs to teachers. She'd never taught anyone anything. She wasn't sure she knew how. On the third morning, Garrett called. Hale wants to meet, he said without preamble. When? Today. Whenever you're ready. I'll be there in an hour. She hung up and looked at the compass on the nightstand. Then she put it in her jacket pocket, where it sat heavy and warm against her ribs, and went to meet Hale. The conference room was the same one. Hale was there, and Garrett, and a third person she hadn't seen before. A woman in her mid-40s with the bearing of someone who had spent significant time in the field, and even more time in rooms like this one, making decisions about fields she no longer operated in. Her name was Carver, and she was introduced without a title, which in Raven's experience meant the title was either classified or so senior that stating it would be redundant. You said you wanted to talk about what happens next, Raven said, before anyone else could set the agenda. Hale looked mildly surprised. People in his position generally preferred to control the sequencing. Yes, he said. So, talk. He glanced at Carver, who looked at Raven with an expression of someone conducting an assessment they'd already partially completed. The Vasquez doctrine, Carver said. Her voice was even and direct without being cold. We've been having an internal conversation about it for longer than you might think. The dissolution of the program was, she paused, choosing the word, premature. You think, Raven said. The operational record supports it. 16 extractions, 23 protective operations, 0 casualties among protected elements over the program's 11 years. Those numbers don't reflect a failed methodology. The numbers reflect Vasquez, Raven said. He was running most of those operations personally until year 8. And then he was training you, Carver said. Raven was quiet. The Blackstone Highlands operation, Carver continued, produced a specific kind of outcome that is difficult to account for using conventional metrics. 15 people came home from a situation where the actuarial probability of full team survival was, she looked at a paper in front of her, under 4% according to the assessment run at day 7. Who ran that assessment? We did. You knew they were in there. We knew the situation had deteriorated beyond conventional rescue parameters. Carver held her gaze. That's why we approved the insertion. Raven looked at Garrett. He was looking at his hands again. You approved it, she said, but it doesn't exist. Correct? And if I'd failed? Then 15 people died in a mountain range that isn't on any operational map, and we'd have grieved them privately and moved on. The room held that for a moment. I appreciate the honesty, Raven said. Because she did, actually. The dishonest version would have been harder to sit across from. What I'm proposing, Carver said, is something different from what existed before. Not a covert program in the traditional sense. Something smaller, structured around transmission rather than operation. Raven waited. You pass it on, Carver said. The doctrine, the methodology, the complete Vasquez framework, whatever you have of it, to a small group of candidates we've been identifying. You build the curriculum, you run the instruction, you determine who's ready and who isn't. A training program. A continuity program. The distinction matters. Raven looked at her. How many candidates? Initially 4. We expand based on demonstrated viability. Who selects them? You do. From a pool we provide. Final selection authority is yours. She sat with that for a moment, looked at the table surface, which was the same table surface as before, and had the same quality of institutional permanence that table surfaces in government conference rooms always had. Vasquez had a specific philosophy about who the doctrine would work for, she said. It wasn't about capability. There are plenty of capable people. We know, Carver said. That's why we're asking the person he selected. He selected me because I was broken in the right ways, Raven said. Because I'd already learned that the work was more important than being seen doing it. You can't teach that to someone who hasn't arrived at it themselves. Then teach them how to arrive at it, Carver said. The room was quiet. Location, Raven said. A facility we maintain in Montana. Existing infrastructure, isolated, appropriate terrain for field instruction. It's been used for other programs and can be repurposed without drawing attention. Timeline. We'd like to begin in 60 days. 90, Raven said. Hale frowned slightly. The urgency, 90 days, she said again. I need to rebuild the curriculum from what I carry, which means writing down things that were never written down in a form that can be taught without the teacher being Vasquez. That takes time if you want it done right. She looked at him. You want it done right. Hale looked at Carver. 90 days, Carver said. Raven looked at the table, at her hands on it, at the place where the compass sat in her pocket and pressed against her ribs. There's a condition, she said. Name it. Webb's report. The informal one Logan filed on my behalf. I want it moved from whatever file it's currently buried in and placed in the program record. Not publicly, just placed where it belongs. Carver looked at her for a moment. Why? Because Vasquez's work deserves a record, she said. Even a classified one. Even one nobody reads. She paused. Everything that happened on that mountain should exist somewhere as something other than a favorable weather event. The silence ran for several seconds. Done, Carver said. She was in the hallway outside the conference room when Garrett caught up with her. He fell into step beside her without speaking for most of the corridor's length. You could have asked for more, he said finally. I asked for what I needed. You saved 15 people, Raven. You could have used that as leverage for what? She stopped walking. He stopped too. A better cover identity? A higher operational budget? Garrett, I didn't do it for currency. He looked at her. He looked tired, she noticed. Not the temporary tired of someone who'd had a hard week, but the accumulated kind, the same kind she saw in the mirror. "I know that," he said. "Then why say it?" "Because I spent 11 days watching a situation deteriorate and trying to get assets to you and hitting walls at every turn. And by the time the Pavehawk lifted off, I'd written 3 different versions of the call I was going to make to—" He stopped. "I'd written it in my head. The call." She understood what call he meant. "You didn't have to make it," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't." They stood in the corridor. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Fluorescent light did its flat, institutional work on everything. "The monograph," she said, Vasquez's final document. "Is it actually gone?" Garrett's face did something complicated. "Why?" "Because Crow has been looking for it for 4 years and hasn't found it, and you reacted when I mentioned it in the debrief." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she had her answer before he gave it. "It's not gone," he said. "Where is it?" "With me." He said it like it cost something. "He gave it to me before the dissolution. I knew what was coming, and he knew the institutional channels would bury it. And he gave it to me and told me to keep it until someone needed it." She looked at him. "I've been waiting," he said, "for the right someone." She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside somewhere, traffic moved through a city going about its ordinary life, and in this corridor 2 people stood with the weight of a dead man's life work between them. "Send it to Montana," she said, "before the 90 days are up." He nodded. Once. The kind of nod that was also a promise, the kind that people who worked in this world made instead of handshakes. She walked out of the building into cold afternoon air and felt something shift in the architecture of what she'd been carrying. The news about Crow's operation reached her 6 weeks later, through channels that were technically not supposed to carry that kind of signal, but did anyway. The clearing had lost its primary contract, not the Blackstone operation specifically. The dissolution had been broader than that, touching multiple clients simultaneously. The kind of cascading commercial failure that happened when the specific value proposition an organization offered was called into question by a single high-profile miss. Crow had built his reputation on results. The Highlands had produced a result he couldn't explain without admitting the existence of a variable his clients didn't know about. The organization contracted, and Crow went quiet in the way that people in his world went quiet. Not retired, not arrested, just smaller and less visible than before. She thought about him occasionally, about the way he'd stood in the flat area with his hands visible and his rifle slung and delivered a field assessment with the honesty of someone who'd long since stopped finding honesty inconvenient. She thought about what he'd said, that what she'd done on the mountain was the most sophisticated individual field operation he'd seen in 20 years. She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she put it in the same place she put the things she didn't know what to do with and kept moving. Montana in April still had snow on the high ground, which was appropriate. The facility was what Carver had described. Existing infrastructure, nothing conspicuous. A cluster of low buildings in a valley with terrain that climbed in every direction and offered what a serious instructor would recognize immediately as exceptional training ground. She arrived 3 days before the candidates to walk the property alone, to understand it the way she understood terrain, which was by moving through it without agenda and letting it tell her what it was. It told her it was functional and cold and isolated and adequate. Vasquez would have liked it. She set up the instruction space in what had been a storage room, which she preferred to the larger classroom because a smaller room created a certain kind of pressure that was useful for what she needed to teach. She covered the walls with nothing, no maps, no diagrams, nothing to look at except the other person in the room, which was the first lesson embedded before anyone sat down. The curriculum had taken her 60 of the 90 days to build. 32 separate training modules ranging from technical skills she could quantify and measure to conceptual frameworks. She could only approximate in language and then had to demonstrate in field exercises until the approximation became unnecessary. She'd written it in a notebook first, longhand, because typing felt wrong for material that had been transmitted voice to voice for 30 years. Then she'd typed it, because it needed to exist in a form more durable than her handwriting. When Vasquez's monograph arrived, a USB drive in a plain envelope, no return address, delivered to the facility office, she read it in one sitting. It was 47 pages, single-spaced, written in the spare, direct prose of a man who had never been interested in how he sounded, only in what he was communicating. She read it once and then sat with it for a day before reading it again. The second time she found the passage she hadn't expected. Near the end, in a section about what the doctrine asked of the people who carried it, a section that was less operational than anything else in the document, written in a different register, the register of someone getting close to the end of something and deciding to say the things they'd been leaving unsaid. The cost of this work, Vasquez had written, is not physical. The physical cost is real and should not be minimized. But the deeper cost is the structural invisibility that the methodology requires and what that invisibility does to a person over time. We are training people to find satisfaction in outcomes they cannot claim, to accept that the most significant thing they do on any given day will be attributed to luck, weather, or the competence of someone else. This is a genuine sacrifice and should be named as such. I have seen operatives lose themselves in it, not to burnout, but to the slower erosion of believing that their invisibility is the same as their insignificance. It is not. The work's invisibility is tactical. The person's significance is absolute. Anyone who cannot hold that distinction will eventually be destroyed by this doctrine rather than sustained by it. The instructor's responsibility is to transmit both the methodology and the distinction, particularly the distinction. She read that passage twice. Then she closed the document and sat in the instruction room alone for a while. She thought about what Logan had said, 15 people, and the compass in her pocket, warm against her ribs, the weight of something that had passed through hands in the worst moments and kept being passed forward. She thought about what it meant to be the next person in the line. The 4 candidates arrived on a Tuesday. She met them in the facility's main room and looked at them without speaking for long enough that the silence became uncomfortable for at least 3 of the 4, and she noted which 3. They were a woman named Park, who had 6 years of special reconnaissance and a stillness in her face that suggested she'd already learned some version of what Raven was about to teach her. A man named Osei, who was too large for this work on paper, but who moved with a care that contradicted his size. A former signals officer named Tran, who'd requested reassignment from conventional intelligence work for reasons that the file summarized blandly and that Raven suspected were far more specific. And a man named Calloway, who was the youngest, 26, and who had in his service record a psychological evaluation that used the phrase demonstrates consistent discomfort with individual recognition and had underlined it herself when she'd read it. "My name is irrelevant," she said. "You'll call me nothing, because we won't need names here. You'll know who I'm talking to." Park's expression didn't change. Osei's did, slightly. Adjustment, not surprise. Tran looked at his hands. Calloway looked at her steadily, and she thought about the thing Vasquez had written about holding the distinction and thought that this one already carried some version of it. "What I'm going to teach you," she said, "doesn't exist anywhere that anyone will admit to. When you use it, the best outcome is that no one knows you were there. The second best outcome is that the people you were protecting know something was there but can't prove it. The worst outcome, operationally speaking, is that you become visible. Not because visibility is failure, but because visibility means you've exhausted every other option." She paused. "I will teach you how to never exhaust every other option, but I will also teach you what to do when you do, because you will." I did. Everyone who's ever carried this doctrine eventually has. The room was quiet. "This is not a program that makes you important," she said. "It makes you effective. Those are different things. If you're here because you want the first one, you should leave before we waste each other's time." Nobody left. She looked at them. 4 people who had arrived here by whatever combination of circumstances and choices put people in rooms like this one who were about to spend the next several months learning how to disappear in service of keeping other people alive. "Then we start," she said. Over the following weeks, she taught them everything she knew, which was most of what Vasquez had known, which was the most complete version of the doctrine that existed anywhere outside 47 pages of single-space text on a USB drive that she kept in the same jacket pocket as the compass. She taught them to read terrain not as obstacle, but as architecture, to understand patrol timing as a language with grammar and rhythm, to perform maintenance on equipment that wasn't theirs without leaving evidence of the work, to transmit in protocols so old they were invisible, to make decisions in the space between heartbeats when all the information they needed was present but not yet assembled. She taught them, harder and with more revision than anything else, to find satisfaction in outcomes they couldn't claim. That last one took the longest. It took Calloway 4 weeks to understand it intellectually, and another 3 to demonstrate that he'd absorbed it in a way that would hold under field conditions. Tran understood it immediately, and in the wrong way, as self-erasure rather than discipline, and she spent 2 weeks unbuilding that interpretation before rebuilding it correctly. Park had been living some version of it for years without having language for it, and the language, when it arrived, seemed to settle something in her that had been unsettled for a long time. Osei was the surprise. The largest person in the program, the one she'd had private reservations about despite selecting him, turned out to be the most naturally patient of the 4. He moved through field exercises with a quality that took her a while to name and finally did. He moved like he belonged wherever he was, which was the hardest thing to teach, and the thing that couldn't be taught at all, only either present or not. He had it. Vasquez had said the same thing about her once. She hadn't understood what he meant at the time. She understood it watching Osei move through a night exercise on the 4th week and disappear into terrain that should not have been able to conceal him, and reappear in a position nobody had expected, and complete the objective without disturbing a single sensor she'd placed on the route. She let herself feel something about that for a moment. Something that was not pride exactly, but was the closest relative of pride that the work allowed. Then she went back to teaching. The official documentation of the program, when it was filed at the end of the first cycle, was 2 pages. It described a training initiative, referenced no specific doctrine or methodology, listed no instructor name. It was the thinnest paper record for the most significant thing Raven had done since the Highlands. She signed it with an operational designator, not her name. Hale reviewed it and sent 1 line of response, approved for continuation. Carver sent nothing, which Raven interpreted correctly as satisfaction. Garrett sent a photograph. No message, no caption, just a photograph. It was the exterior of the facility in Montana, taken from the high ground to the east. The same angle she'd used to survey the property on arrival, though she hadn't told anyone she'd done that. In the image, the facility was small against the valley, and the terrain climbed behind it in every direction, and the sky above was the particular color of high-altitude mornings. He'd been here, recently. He'd walked the ground the same way she had. She looked at the photograph for a long time, and then she put her phone down and went to teach the afternoon session. 6 months after the Highlands, on a Thursday in October, that was cold and clear and smelled like the kind of air that preceded the first real winter weather, she received a message routed through channels she barely used anymore. It was from Logan. She didn't know how he'd gotten the routing. She didn't ask. My son's team won their first game of the season yesterday. He scored twice. Still terrible footwork, but the kid does not quit. I don't know if you need to hear this. I know I don't know much about what you need, but I thought you should know that there's a 9-year-old in Tacoma who got to celebrate something yesterday because you made a choice on a mountain I'll never be able to fully explain to him. He won't know your name, but he'll know his dad came home. She read it twice in the instruction room with the late afternoon light coming through the single window. She thought about writing back. She started twice and stopped twice because there was nothing she could say that added to what he'd said, and adding to it would diminish it. She put the phone in her pocket, picked up the compass from the desk where it sat now, where it would sit for as long as she was in this room. Held it for a moment. Then she went to find her students. Park was running a night navigation exercise with Calloway. Tran was in the signals room running burst transmission protocols for the 11th time, not because he'd failed them, but because he hadn't failed them 11 times yet, and he was the kind of person who wanted 12. Osei was somewhere on the eastern slope doing something she hadn't assigned, and she would review his field log in the morning and find out what. She walked outside into the October cold and stood in the dark for a while. The stars above Montana were the specific bright of high altitude and no light pollution, the kind of sky that made the scale of things apparent in a way city life carefully obscured. She stood in it and breathed the cold air and felt the compass in her jacket pocket and the weight of the monograph on the desk inside and the weight of 4 people somewhere on this property learning how to disappear. She thought about Vasquez, about the training room with no windows, about everything he'd given her that she'd spent years carrying alone and was finally, imperfectly, passing forward. She thought about a 9-year-old in Tacoma who scored twice and had terrible footwork and didn't quit. She thought about 12 men on a mountain who'd never known how close every night had been, and about the fact that not knowing was exactly as it should have been, because the work's value had never been in being known for it. She looked at the stars for a long time. Then she went back inside because there was work to do and people to teach and a doctrine that needed to exist in more hands than hers, and because that was the job she'd chosen, and she had chosen it. Not the erased parts, not the invisible parts, not the parts that cost her things she'd never fully tally. She had chosen the core of it, the thing underneath all the methodology and the tradecraft and the doctrine. The choice to be the person who stayed. The choice to be the thing between danger and the people who couldn't see it coming. The choice, made over and over on cold mountains and in quiet rooms and in the space between heartbeats, to make sure everyone else got to go home. She sat down at the desk and opened the curriculum notebook and picked up a pen and kept working. The compass sat on the desk beside her, its needle pointing north, steady and sure, the way things point when they've been doing it long enough to know nothing else. Outside, her students moved through the dark, learning how to protect the world without leaving fingerprints on it. The mountains kept their secrets, and the work went on. The ones who never take the credit are the ones who make it possible for everyone else to come home. That kind of courage doesn't need an